Within this podcast episode, we discuss topics that may be upsetting or triggering to some listeners. Topics such as abortion, maternal mortality rate, racism, sexism, white supremacy, and white nationalism will be mentioned. In episode 43 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, the topic may surprise some listeners, because not everyone may see the direct correlation between the overturn of Roe v. Wade and the Outdoor Minimalist mission. But the thing is, environmental justice is directly tied to reproductive justice and women's rights. And in the wake of this life-altering event for every individual in the United States, it was only right that we covered it on this podcast. I understand that this can be a heavy topic, but it is not one that we can or should ignore. Media is a powerful tool, no matter the topic, but it can also lead to an oversaturation of information and the spread of misinformation. Because of this, I did not feel comfortable covering this topic alone. That's why I reached out to an organization that has been fighting relentlessly for women's reproductive rights and access to healthcare for years, Pro-Choice Washington. Kia Guarino is the executive director of Pro-Choice Washington, the lead organization focused on political and legislative advocacy for reproductive freedom in Washington state. Kia has a background in global health and international development, economics, policy, and advocacy, having worked at several global organizations, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Albright Stonebridge Group, the Clinton Foundation, and Amnesty International. She is dedicated to the advancement of reproductive rights and social justice. So thank you so much, Kia, for jumping on today to chat about this important topic. I know it was really last minute, but it's something that everyone should be talking about and should be caring about. So I'm really happy that someone as educated on the topic as you can explain a lot of things. So before we kind of jump into it, we can start with a little more lighthearted of a topic and discuss the things you like about the outdoors and some of your favorite activities.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Meg, for having me. I am absolutely an outdoor enthusiast. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and obviously there is an incredible range of outdoor options here. And I'm a big fan of backpacking, kayaking, climbing, just really exploring all the different beautiful parts of this state, and have been doing that for many years. And I'm really excited to be on this podcast for all the reasons you mentioned, and because I truly believe in outdoor activities.
And just out of curiosity, are you from the Pacific Northwest?
I'm actually from New England originally. My family has been from New England for a very long time, many generations, but moved out here about 5.5 years ago and really fell in love.
That's awesome. Yeah, I am also a transplant to the Pacific Northwest, and it's beautiful. So let's talk a little bit about your role, because as I said in the introduction, you're the executive director of Pro-Choice Washington. So how long have you been in this role, and what is Pro-Choice Washington?
So Pro-Choice Washington is the only grassroots advocacy nonprofit that is solely focused on driving political and legislative change to protect reproductive rights and freedoms in Washington state. And I have been in this role since 2020. So my very first day on the job was the day that Amy Coney Barrett was sworn in. So we have really been working since that moment in preparation for the decision that was brought down last week.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people that decision was really surprising, but it wasn't necessarily a sudden decision. First of all, love the work that you're doing. We're really glad that Pro-Choice Washington exists. But before we talk about the actual overturn of Roe versus Wade, can we talk about kind of the progression that it took to get to this place?
Yeah, I love that question. So it does feel really sudden, I think, for folks, many folks across the country, but this has been a concerted effort by far-right groups and conservative groups for about 50 years. Ever since Roe was put into place, there has been a long-term, very persistent, very well-funded effort to achieve what was achieved last week, which is the overturning of the federal protection policies. And it has taken a lot of investment at the really local level by these conservative groups. It has taken a narrative shift around what abortion care actually means for people in an everyday life. And it has taken consistent participation in elections, even at the very local level. And so what we're seeing is the culmination of a lot of time and effort that was often unseen, really took place under the radar, or was hidden by the idea that abortion is somehow fringe or not a healthcare issue. And so folks weren't really seeing this action taking place in the general public.
Yeah, I think unless you're kind of integrated into those more conservative environments, it would be kind of hard to notice because we do tend to just pay attention to what's happening in our communities. That can be kind of dangerous.
I mean, it was like I said, very well coordinated and concerted effort, which is why we talk about how important grassroots advocacy is on the protection of healthcare side, because it takes so long and it takes so much collective action, as we've seen, and that we really, need to be matching that energy, or really exceeding that energy for the protection of rights.
Yeah, it's kind of a long haul. It's not going to happen overnight. But how long has Pro-Choice Washington been an organization? I'm not sure if you already said that.
No, I didn't. So Pro-Choice Washington has been around in some shape or form for 50 years, pretty much since the early 1970s, since the passage of Roe. We transitioned to a completely independent organization in fall of last year. So we're now fully focused on our state and region work, when we were previously part of NARAL.
And for people that don't know, can you explain what that is as well?
So NARAL was and is a national level organization that is focused on reproductive rights activism. And so we were part of the state affiliated structure for that organization. And they've switched to fully being focused nationally, and all of the state affiliates are now focused on their state and regional work. So we're all collaborating still. Obviously, this work takes everybody and all hands. But the idea is, because Roe v. Wade was the federal protections for abortion rights, now that there is no federal floor, each state is going to be the place where rights are decided. And so having organizations that are specifically focused on state policy and are very, very familiar and knowledgeable and effective in those spaces, and thinking about what it means to be, uniquely within the Pacific Northwest region, that's going to be where this work is going forward.
So I think that's a good jumping off point for why this really matters and how this really impacts the nation as a whole, because like you said, now a lot of the efforts are moving from a federal level and are becoming a lot more localized. So with the overturn, why is this important and why should people care?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, with something as significant as this decision, it's going to take a while for us to see the full ramifications of what was just decided. But even in Washington State, where we have legal protection still for abortion care, it's a pretty precarious set of protections. And that's not to say that we haven't spent, decades building these legal safeguards. But what we've seen is that it doesn't take a lot for a legislature to overturn those rights. And we've seen that in our neighbor states and across the country. So each individual, depending on where they live, is going to face a very different reproductive journey now in America. And Washington is going to be one of the few states that is going to receive the patients from other states who lost care. So the Guttmacher Institute, which is one of the leading research institutes on this issue, has predicted about a 400% increase in patients seeking care in Washington state. So we are going to see a massive uptick in patients who need care coming to our healthcare systems, which already face barriers, especially for folks who have historically been treated less well within the healthcare system or within broader systems. So just say that is your only interaction, is you'll see a strain on our healthcare system. But broadly speaking, we know that access to abortion is specifically linked to a huge range of socioeconomic and environmental outcomes. And we know that by taking away that right from millions of people, we are going to see significant long-term consequences. So we're expecting a double-digit increase in maternal mortality rates, which means that the death of folks who are pregnant. We expect a significant drop in female participation in the workforce. We expect a significant drop in college graduation rate. There was a study done in 2020 that showed if you are denied a wanted abortion, you are 4 times more likely to end up below the federal poverty line. And so when we think about it, it's often talked about as this niche female issue, but it's so far beyond that. It is a broad socioeconomic and environmental issue because of how those systems are so interactive and how the folks who are most harmed by these types of decisions are also most harmed by, say, the reduction of climate protections or issues around education. And so everybody is going to feel this in this country for a very long time. And then the last piece that I like to share is that really abortion is often painted as this decision for a young woman who doesn't want to have a child. While that is a story and a valid story, there are a lot of different parts of the pregnancy experience that require abortion care to save lives. And so there are things called ectopic pregnancies, which are when a fertilized egg implants outside of the uterus. And if that isn't treated with an abortion procedure, people can die. And then there are miscarriages that don't release on their own, and that can happen at any time during a pregnancy. That's a very common experience for pregnant people. If it doesn't release on its own, you need to use an abortion procedure, otherwise folks will die. These states are already pushing the concept onto things like fertility treatments, like IVF. And so we are talking about something so much broader than what has been sort of painted as a single issue.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of different things there, which are all very important. I think I kind of want to break it down a little bit into like kind of like the different sections, and then it will kind of all come together. And so, like you said, Washington is going to be one of those states that people are coming to for abortions and these medical procedures related to that. Can we talk a little bit about like which areas of the United States are most affected, and then even more specifically, what demographics of people?
So right now, there were several states that had trigger laws in place, which you probably have heard that terminology. And it basically means that states had been preparing for the end of Roe by passing these policies that were not legal until Roe was removed that restricted abortion care. And so there were about 18, I believe is the latest number, of laws that went into play immediately across the country. And then there's several more states, about another 7 or 8 states, that are in the process of passing restrictive policies. And so that means that half of the country is in states that is restricting abortion care. The ones that are protected, we're calling them sanctuary states or oasis states. You often will hear them referred to as that. That includes places like Washington, Oregon, California, so the West Coast, Colorado, New Mexico, and then the New England area. But the middle of the country, outside of those spaces, has really seen a massive reduction in rights. And it varies depending on the state how extreme they are. And then as far as demographics, it's not surprising, but the folks who have already been struggling with health equity in our country are most impacted by this. So we know for a fact that Black women, Indigenous women, other folks of color, folks with lower income, folks in rural areas with fewer health system options, immigrants, and folks with insufficient insurance are going to feel this so much more than other folks. And it's because with the limited access that everyone is going to have, all of the barriers that they face anyway will be exacerbated. So, abortion care is not cheap unless you have the right insurance to cover it. And if you live far away from a health center, it can be very expensive to get there. And sometimes it is impossible to take, say, 3 days off of work or to find childcare to cover while you go and do that. And that's especially true if you're seeking out-of-state care, because it's pretty prohibitive for folks to fly to another state, especially with the cost of airfare now. And so it really just takes all of the things that were already hard around health system access and exacerbates them quite significantly.
Yeah, and so if someone that is seeking this type of medical care is planning to travel or interested in traveling, or just it's like required, then how would they get to a sanctuary state, especially if they didn't have those resources? Like, are organizations like Pro-Choice Washington, do they have programs in place, or is it kind of just up to the individual to sort that out?
I think this is such an important question because you're seeing a lot of euphemisms on social media around camping or around flower shop. There's sort of these euphemisms around people saying that they'd be willing to support people to seek care. And, it's a pretty risky space to be in right now with the laws settling down on what it actually means to quote unquote aid and abet abortion care. And so we strongly encourage folks to, rather than try to create a new system, invest in and support abortion funds. And so abortion funds are sort of less well-known structures, but they've been in place for a very long time, and they're specifically designed to get people the care that they need. And so there's a bunch of different abortion funds across the country that work on doing things like finding transportation, by finding places for people to stay, by finding quality care options, by finding childcare. So they're specifically designed to overcome those barriers. And so I highly encourage folks to look at donating to and volunteering with those established systems, because they really understand how to navigate the systems that are already in play and can help you do it well for those who are interested in helping out.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'll look into that and hopefully post a few links in the episode notes if people want to look into those organizations when they are done listening to this. But you did mention something that I have kind of been curious about and trying to research a little bit more on my own end, is the repercussions of aiding and abetting someone that is seeking that medical care, because it seems kind of like a really big gray area, because can another state control what is happening in a different state than their own if this is up to the states? I guess that's where my confusion comes in.
I think that all the best legal minds are equally as apprehensive about what this will look like in practice. I think right now there aren't laws in place that can punish folks for providing care to folks out of state. But there are efforts by certain states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Idaho to look into making that part of the bill. But typically there has been a long-standing understanding that state sovereignty matters, right? And that's the idea of giving the power to the states. Then you shouldn't have the power to then reach into another state and enforce your laws. This is probably the first issue in modern history. This has come up before, but in modern history where these concepts are being tested again. And I think right now there is a lot of gray area, and there are resources, which I'll also share with you, Meg, about what you can do to look into the risk and assess your risk in both your actions as somebody seeking care, but also your actions as somebody helping get care to somebody. And that's why I would definitely encourage investing into the organizations that are doing a lot of that research as well. So you can really be sure that you are helping in a way that's safe for yourself and safe for the people who are getting care.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll make sure I share whatever resources that you have for people, just so people can have access to that type of information. I have so many questions. You touched on a lot of really great things earlier on, so I'm going to shift back towards what this has to do with rights in general. So this is obviously a women's rights issue, as well as really anyone with a uterus rights issue. So how does this infringe on the rights of women and anyone with a uterus?
This decision infringes on every single part of a person's with a uterus, as a woman's right to be a full member of our society. Like I mentioned earlier, there is this myth of who is impacted by this, and I really need everybody to know that we are all impacted by this. And for a long time, the efforts to control female bodies, or bodies, birthing bodies, has been really connected with the idea of consolidating power, wealth, and influence away from women. And, there is no more effective way to control women than by removing their right to decide if they want to have children and when they want to have them. It is extremely effective in removing people from, positions to vote, positions to be part of the economy, to participate in education, to participate in leadership. All of that has really come about for women in a large way because of Roe. Like, there's some direct lines to what happened for women's ability to be full participants in society once Roe v. Wade was passed in the 1970s. And so by taking that away, you're taking away the basic structure that's needed for broader female participation in society, participation of birthing bodies in society. It's hard to overstate what this means as far as what's open to take away from folks participating in society. And even the way that the decision was written, you've heard probably a lot of this on social media and regular media as well, but the way that they articulated their decision, it opens the door to roll back any civil rights gains that have been established post the writing of the Constitution, and any decision that was rooted within the concept of privacy, because that's really what Roe v. Wade was about, the idea of making private decisions about your body and about how you participate in the society. What we're seeing is a willingness for a court to totally bypass the majority position, which is to uphold Roe v. Wade, and to take a step that is so wide-reaching that we don't really know what the end of this is going to look like. It sounds like a doomsday discussion, but really it is hard to overstate what the protection of abortion rights means for participation in society.
Yeah, and I think that can be really hard to kind of like conceptualize for a lot of people, whether or not you have a uterus, but especially for people outside of that, to understand kind of like the ramifications it has on individuals that might be in their life. Would you be able to explain and break down in more detail kind of like how the stripping of this fundamental human right is now creating a less than mentality, but not even just a mentality, but like how it has the trickle down effect into every aspect of a woman's life?
It's hard to conceptualize, but I think basically our government just said that 50% of this country, your wife, your sister, your daughter, your friend, whomever, does not count when it comes to a consideration of life and well-being. That effectively, the government has decided that our job is to be vessels, and that is more important than our ability to, say, get a job, or to go to school, or to not die from a complication. And just to think about that for a second, if you say male bodies or folks who don't have a uterus, let's say if you're a man in this country, just picture what it would be like for your government to all of a sudden say, you don't actually get to make any choice about your body. We're going to implement vasectomies for everybody. I mean, that's not even close to as harmful as what just happened, but let's say that. That would feel shocking, right? If all of a sudden the government said every man is getting a vasectomy because we believe that that's more important than whatever your choices are around that. And that's effectively what just happened, except that the risks of pregnancy are, I think, 30 times the risks of abortion. And so we're also saying this procedure that we're making you do, or this thing we're making you do because we decided it's more important than your life, actually could result in you dying. But that doesn't matter. Not to mention that it has impact on, whether or not you're able to vote or make money or get yourself out of poverty. So as a person who maybe isn't directly impacted it from the sense of your body, decisions being made about your individual body, think about what that would feel like for your friends. How scary that is. And for some reason, we've been able to think about abortion as something separate, right? Like that it's, a charity issue, or it's an issue that's not related to us individually. But that's not what that decision was really about.
Not at all. So you did touch on this a little bit earlier, and I do really, really want to emphasize the fact that this is not really just about this one right. This is not just one right being attacked or anything like that. It is a part of a much bigger problem and a bigger issue of the government encroaching on a lot of rights and a lot of equity that we have been seeking in the United States. So, as you mentioned before, the right to health care is being infringed on, but then also how is this related to like racial injustices or environmental injustices?
This is so deeply interconnected to all of those justice fights. And from the perspective of what's being taken away, the leadership of groups that are white nationalist groups that were part of January 6th, that are part of taking away trans care rights, that are part of taking away voting rights, and are part of taking away abortion rights, they're all interconnected. They're all the same groups. And so when you think about it that way, you have a really clear, broader agenda of which this is one. And the ultimate goal is to remove the power from folks who are either historically marginalized groups, women, whomever is in sort of a down power position. There is like a very clear collective agenda moving at the same time. And I think there's no better demonstration of that than the Supreme Court decisions this last session. And they hit on almost every single one of those pieces, and they consistently sided away from collective well-being and progress towards justice and towards the protection of guns and the protection of corporations to harm the environment, right? Like it's all the same group of consolidating this power and this sort of very capitalistic and harmful perspective and away from the protection of broader human rights. And you also see that these movements are really interconnected because it's a lot of the same folks are facing the greatest barriers across all of those movements, right? Like in the environmental justice movement, it's all about making sure that folks have the right to live in a healthy, safe, and sustainable environment, which is the same thing around, say, reproductive justice, which is about raising families in a safe, healthy, sustainable environment. But the same folks who are facing the biggest barriers to achieving that sit across all of those issues. So, like I mentioned before, Black folks, Indigenous folks, folks with lower income, immigrants, they all are being subject to this broader movement of removing rights and relegating folks further and further from power positions. And all of it, and for forever, for hundreds of years, the idea has been controlling people so that power remains in the hands of a collective few, right? And that's just what we're seeing again on a large scale. And what's really scary is what's coming down the pike for the Supreme Court in future sessions, which is specific protections of voting rights, of the ability for people to vote and not vote, as well as continued reviews of what it means to actually safely participate in this society.
Since the time of this recording, it's been, I think, a week since it has been overturned. And so I think a lot of people are maybe moving through the stages of grief, or they're just like in a really heightened state of anger and anxiety. And I think that can make it really hard to have any type of collective action or even constructive conversations. So I guess I have two questions. So I'll pose the first one because it's related to what you were just talking about. I think it's important to see how interconnected all of these issues of justice are, because it can lead to more collective action. So if you care about climate change, if you care about racial injustices, if you care about healthcare and access to healthcare, poverty, any of those things, how can you work towards this collective goal of reinstating these rights?
On the progressive side, we have sort of factioned into these different social issues because it is such a complex system that it can be really overwhelming that we sort of break it down into these issue areas. But it's all the same that we're fighting for, which is progress, and we're working towards the inclusion of better policies. And I think part of what needs to happen now is that willingness to come together and recognize exactly what you just said, which is that this is all the same work. We all come with different expertise around how one issue impacts people specifically, and that's really important. But ultimately speaking, we're talking about the same folks experiencing a broad range of a reduction of rights, a huge amount of effort to control their power and influence and participation in society through all these different channels. And it's time now for us to come together and just work towards rights, for pushing towards the protection of the remaining democracy that we have, and really being willing to come together and be forward moving, even in a space that is imperfect. And I've seen a lot of expressed frustration, understandable frustration with the system, the democratic system that we have, which again, completely valid and understandable. And, I really encourage folks to still participate in it, as fruitless as it can feel sometimes, because the only way to ensure that we lose more power is to not participate in the system at all of voting. And so really holding on, we're in this really tenuous space right now where we need to come together and agree that we will do what it takes to keep out the far right candidates, the white nationalist candidates who are trying to fully take away rights and more, punish people for participating in society. That we need to come together across the issue areas and show up and trust that this is a long-term fight that we're going to come to together, that it is a collective movement that is the vast majority, which I think is another really important point for folks to remember. This is a majority movement that we have, a vast majority movement. And so by factioning ourselves off, we play into the idea that we are not unified as a collective who believes in the forward momentum of society. But we are. And so, I think it is, getting an understanding as an individual of how your issue interacts across all of the things that the Supreme Court is looking at this year. It's a good example. And then how you can really come together with partners in those spaces.
Yeah, I think it can be really easy to fall in that idea of individualism because it's really been beaten into us in the American education system. And I think that is a big barrier for people because you really just kind of see yourself as an individual and being alone. So you don't necessarily always grasp that when all of the individuals come together, it is very powerful. And I do kind of feel like just the idea of polarization in the country, especially during the Trump era and then COVID and all this stuff, it was very polarizing politically, and people drifted away from each other, even if some of their beliefs did overlap. And so I do want to talk about a lot of action items here as we come to the end. And so kind of the first one is, how can we constructively have conversations about this? Because I know like in a lot of family systems, friend groups, even partnerships, there will be varying views around healthcare, women's rights, etc. So how can we talk about this to maybe a pro-life uncle?
We published a guide called How to Talk About Abortion, and it dives into a little bit of the language that you need to use or can be helpful in a conversation. And I think one of the main things in that guide, and that is true even in this time of contention, is that most of the time people's core values are actually quite aligned. And by even saying that someone is pro-life, the movement for abortion care is inherently much more pro-life. There's a lot of death associated with the removal of abortion rights. And so if you believe in life and the protection of individualism, which a lot of that, pro-life movement holds, then there's a lot of really core values that you can align on. And I think the other thing, it's very easy and again, very reasonable to feel like it's hard to have a conversation with somebody who is not willing to understand that your humanity is being questioned or that your life is being quite literally threatened by this decision. It's easy to come at it with anger, dismissal, criticism of someone's intelligence, all of those things, because it's scary to have somebody question whether your life is worth protecting, right? Because it's inherently what that conversation is about. If you come at it from a place of understanding, of being clear that you get that they're coming from a place of, in theory, love, in theory, wanting to protect life, you can reach a better understanding starting from a values space. I think that there's also a lot of misinformation that's out there. And so educating yourself on the truth is a really powerful way to counter, without being anger-filled dialogue, to really counter what's out there. And a lot of people are being fed a lot of really false information about this. And so being prepared to counter that well is also super helpful.
I really like that you said at the core of both issues, for most people, I can't necessarily say all people, but for most people, we are kind of coming from the same place. It's just kind of like our understanding of things are different. And if we can have more empathy during those conversations, I think we could become less polarized and it would be beneficial.
The irony is that Roe v. Wade was one of the most inherently individual and American value-based decisions. So the folks that were fighting to overturn it often actually hold those same values very publicly, which is like individual right to make a decision about your body that will impact your ability to be part of a society as an individual, and that you have a right to protect your privacy around that. Like, that is just such an inherently American value that I would say the majority of folks who consider themselves on the quote unquote other side actually talk about those issues every single day. And it's core to their other work. But for some reason, abortion has been sort of exceptionalized from that narrative. But really, that's what it's about.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So something I personally have been struggling with, and I know a lot of my friends have as well, is kind of how we carry on and work together in a space that is productive, because a lot of people have really high levels of anxiety. We're trying to navigate all of the news and information. Most of us are becoming oversaturated with information, and we can't really tackle any action items. So before we get to the action items, I think that it is important to talk about first how we can manage our emotions, our anxiety, and our stress.
One of the main tactics of the groups that are working to take away rights is to overwhelm. And so it's effective because it's really easy to retreat into burnout or to shut down when you're being faced with the magnitude of what we talked about earlier, what it really means to be told that by your government. I encourage folks to not doom scroll, as tempting as that is, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, even on the progressive advocacy side, social platforms, to take the space and time you need to actually grieve and mourn what just happened, the loss of something really core to your rights. And probably all of us have participated in, reproductive systems to be able to be where we are. So really mourning what we thought was settled law. And then thinking about this again as the long term, right? This is the long term, and we're going to be shocked a lot by the changes that are happening in our country. And yet we know that this is going to take probably more generations to get back. And we have a responsibility, and so the arc of history, to be willing to be in it. And I think there are really a lot of things that people can do every day to maintain the power that we do have. And even though it feels like we've lost power in this country, and in some ways it has been deeply curtailed, we actually still have a lot. And if we allow ourselves to be overwhelmed and removed from action or from this conversation, then we give space to the folks who have been doing this, like I said, for 50 years, who know that it's a long game, who are ready to keep pushing. We don't really have the luxury of standing back. And that's the same for all these justice movements, right? Including climate justice. We don't really have the luxury if we believe in investing in the future of our country. And so I think taking the time to mourn is really important. Stepping away from all of the fear and anxiety that comes out of reading too much about this. And then when you're ready, when you feel ready, stepping back in and knowing that there are a lot of things you can do. And those include things like having those really informed one-on-one conversations rather than just heated social media exchange. Like, well, who are the people in your life that you can really start to create ground level change through those dialogues? And what does that actually look like when you think about this as a long-term conversation? It includes activism through dollars. So donating is actually a very powerful form of activism. And there are groups that have been established for a long time, like the abortion funds, like Pro-Choice Washington, who have been working on this and really actually know what to do, but have been chronically under-resourced because this issue has been considered so fringe and so political. So speaking with your dollars, voting with your dollars is really important. And that includes thinking about which companies and organizations are standing up in this moment. And then there's also spaces for you to volunteer as well with the abortion funds. They look for people who want to help and be a little bit more hands-on in that space. And then finally, as I mentioned before, voting is so essential. As difficult as it feels to be in a system that has shown that it doesn't represent the majority well, ceding room to folks who want to take our power entirely is the best way to ensure that they do. This election, this midterm election, is critical because there has already been a bill to introduce a federal abortion ban introduced. And it will not take that much in the next couple of years to get that through if we aren't really careful about thinking who we want in office and really telling those folks what we need from them and what we believe in. And that includes every single level of government. And I think one of the areas that we've really lost ground is on the hyper-local elections. And that's the same for any justice issue, right? There are folks in judges' positions. There are folks who are in school boards, and we haven't been paying as close attention to those races as the white nationalist groups have, and they have been placing people in power over the last several years. And that is actually where a lot of power is defined. And so thinking about your civic participation as bigger than just voting every 4 years or not voting at all because you're frustrated with the system, which again is valid. But those are all really tangible ways that you still have influence. We don't have the luxury to cede those pieces of power, nor should we, because that's what's being asked of us. We should lean into it.
And I think on your website you have those action items kind of listed out. So I'll make sure I share that page in the show notes as well, just so people can reference that. There's a lot of great resources on the Pro-Choice Washington website. Whether or not you live in Washington state, it can give you a good jumping off point. And the topic of voting with your dollar, as well as in your local elections and the midterm elections, is so powerful, and it is something that across all of the movements for these injustices have in common. To kind of like close things out, I do want to talk about two things. One, when you're voting in the midterm elections, and then like even in future elections, because like you said, this is a long game. A lot of those seats in like hyper-local elections, they go unopposed. And so beyond just voting, if you are someone that is knowledgeable in politics, you live in that area, you could also consider running. Like that's kind of dangerous to say, but why not, I guess?
Say that we're not represented, which is generally true, then we need to be out there,
yes,
unfortunately, for now, to protect them and then to improve them.
Yes. And then on the idea of voting with your dollar, this is something that in the Outdoor Minimalist book, the podcast, the mission as a whole, and in the full climate action and advocacy, we talk on this point probably way too much, but not enough at the same time. People will hear me say it all of the time, like vote with your dollar. It is a boycott, and it's something that you have to do for more than just a few days. All across social media platforms, I'm seeing these things like, just don't buy things for the 4th of July weekend, and that will show them. And like, that's great. That's great. I'm glad people are starting to think of this and research where they are investing their money. But also, like you're saying, this is going to take a long time. And so you have to divest in those companies, but make it a lifestyle. So instead of not buying, like, I don't know, support local businesses, farmers markets, women-owned, minority-owned, all of those things that I think we have been preaching for so long. It's now becoming less fringe, as you say.
We are used to a time period where we have really quick actions, things don't last very long, we're on to the next thing, and we cannot be subject to that for these two movements.
Awesome. I really appreciate you being here, Kia. It has been like a difficult week for a lot of people. Yeah. And so I think that it's helpful to have someone as educated as you on the topic guide us in the right direction.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the link between these two movements and the work that we all are doing together.
If you want to learn more about Pro-Choice Washington, need resources about reproductive health care, or you want to support their work, please visit prochoicewashington.org.